Well, actually, I do have a rule that I don't inhale before I speak on a microphone. So my plan is to inhale after I've spoken on the microphone. Thanks everyone for coming today, and happy MardiGrass to you all. I would obviously like to acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land, and I think it's the Bunjurong people are the traditional custodians of this area, and I'd certainly like to pay my respects to any elders here today and any emerging leaders of our Aboriginal community. And we know that our Aboriginal brothers and sisters have been affected by Prohibition more than just about anyone else in our community in Australia over the last 70 years. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders of Nimbin and the elders of MardiGrass, and even to my partner Robbie Swan, who was here in the 1973 Aquarius Festival, when we thought that legalisation was just going to happen. It was just a matter of time. You know, we had a former Prime Minister who was one of the ambassadors for Normal at that time. What was his name? John Gorton. He wasn't a very good Prime Minister, but he certainly went up in my estimations when I heard that he acted as an ambassador for a cannabis legalisation organisation, an international one. Unfortunately, we've kind of slipped back a little bit. So today, I'd just like to quickly cover, I suppose, an update of what I've been doing in Victoria, an update on what I've learned as part of my political work and the opportunities I've had to travel as a politician overseas, and also then maybe touch and discuss what we could all be doing to change these laws. So, you know, it's kind of nice being in here and having this beautiful green aroma coming through and the beautiful plants, because politics is kind of a rough game, and they tend to see who's got the most testosterone, and that can get pretty stinky. It also means that there's a constant battle to the bottom, and I think this is one of the challenges, that how can we raise our politicians up, and how can we get them to aspire to better regulation, not who can be the least worst or the toughest. And I think we're getting there, because public sentiment has definitely changed, and we're seeing it everywhere. We're seeing that now, and this is the first time that more people support cannabis legalisation than don't support it. And we know in the US it's at around 60%, but in Australia it's now around 43%. Now, I've said 2, but I actually think there's more than that. We've seen the legalisation across the US. We've seen the numerous Netflix programs, you know, I guess that legal cannabis is now kind of in that very public zeitgeist, and you've got all of these different programs on places like Netflix, but you're also seeing countries that we think are rather sensible, like Canada, legalising. And I know there's differing opinions today and at this conference around what Canada's doing. As a politician, I will speak about Canada as a politician, probably not actually in the way that many other people have. There has been, I think medicinal cannabis obviously helps us. You know, when you see a medicinal cannabis plant and a medicinal cannabis being as a medicine, to see it then as something that could send you to jail doesn't kind of add up, and I think that really is starting to change. And I think probably the most important thing is just more people have had cannabis. We're now, you know, my parents were probably the last generation that cannabis wasn't that common amongst their peers. It was common amongst my peers, and it's a common thing. We now have, I think it sits at around over 40 to 50% of Australians have used cannabis at some stage, and around 15% currently actively use it. So these issues should give us hope. And I just thought I would quickly touch on what Canada did, because I personally, and for me in Victoria, I see Canada as quite a good model and quite a good argument and quite a good presentation for convincing other politicians that, that I'm right and that all of us are right. So they took this three-pronged approach. Let's keep cannabis out of the hands of criminals and children. Now, I think we could have just stopped there. If that was the question you posed to politicians, now how do we keep cannabis out of the hands of criminals? Well, certainly Prohibition's not doing that. In fact, Prohibition hands it to the criminals. How do we control it over who has it and access by children? Well, certainly having absolutely no control of it through Prohibition doesn't do that. Again, keeping the profits out of the hands of criminals. The police report in Victoria that the cannabis industry, the illicit cannabis industry in Victoria alone is worth $1.1 billion. And I think we've got John Jiggin speaking somewhere who will also have some federal figures, or someone might be able to tell us a bit later. And reduce the burden. We know that, again, most, and it's extraordinary in 2019 to say this, but most drug arrests are for cannabis. Now, this just seems an incredible waste of time for the police. And yes, we've got some diversion programs, we've got levels of decriminalisation for personal possession in some jurisdictions, but still, more people are arrested for cannabis than any other drug. And this does take up police time. So the new Canadian laws will allow the sale of cannabis. They will allow you to consume cannabis. And when I was over there, this was a really interesting question because of their smoking laws. So they have like apartment buildings or complexes of apartments where it's completely smoke-free. And you can't smoke in your apartments, on your balconies. You can smoke in certain designated areas. But that was a real quandary for the health department because cannabis is smoked in such a different way. It's not like tobacco. It doesn't have those same addictive qualities that tobacco has. It's something that you do to socialise very often. So do we want to send people outside, round the back near the garbage bins, to smoke cannabis, particularly in Toronto where it's -30? So they've actually came up with the notion that you would be able to smoke it in public, and you also it would be, and what I liked is that it would be treated differently to tobacco as a smokable product. They've also certainly allowed you to share it, and they've allowed you to grow it. And I think they've hit a path that probably doesn't make anybody happy, and that's generally what politicians try and do. If everybody is equally unhappy about the legislation, then it's probably not bad legislation. Now, this is politicians. Of course you recognise that because they're wearing funny hats for a photo opportunity. We didn't have high-vis vests, but this was when I took a range of politicians, and actually the one on the far right, the one who was actually trying to get out of the photo, is Deputy Commissioner Rick Nugent. So this was the first time that a police officer had travelled with a parliamentary group anywhere, and he came on the Wild and Wonderful drug tour. And that photo doesn't show you, but he did have a good time. He didn't inhale, and every time I tried to get him to, he'd disappear. But all of these politicians travelled over there, and these were Conservative politicians, Liberal, Labor, and myself. And this is them at a cannabis cookie factory. And they were blown away by it. We also took them we took them through Colorado. We spent 2 or 3 days in Colorado, in Denver specifically. We met with the police. We met with the health department. We met with the Treasury Department. We then met with the industry associations, and we took a tour of facilities that were growing for adult use. We also went to some of the retail outlets for that adult use. We did the same looking at retail outlets in Canada, in Vancouver in particular, and we also went and spoke to California just as they were about to go down this path. Now, on tour, most of these guys were convinced that cannabis legalisation could work. Get them back home, they're a little less comfortable with it. But when I speak around Parliament about legalising cannabis or looking at what Canada's doing, looking at what California's doing, looking at what other jurisdictions are doing, you know, some of them, the dollar signs start flashing up in their heads and they start saying, well, yeah, this is millions of dollars of revenue that we're missing out on. Others, you know, like all of us, I assume, have probably tried cannabis and their world didn't end. And even if they didn't, they had friends who tried cannabis and their worlds didn't end. In fact, I was on a parliamentary tour to regional Victoria, and at the end of the evening, before we went to bed, I had a joint and I was smoking it in the car park of this motel. And one of the other members of the committee was outside smoking a cigarette with 2 glasses of Baileys, one in each hand. Oh, she was fagging away, and she offered me one, and I said, no, I've got a joint. Would you like some? And she went, oh, well, no, I wouldn't. But, I mean, we've all done it in our college days, and that's the fact. That is the truth. You know, so many of those politicians have done it in their time, just like we have. In fact, I actually went to a birthday party for a former Attorney General in a state, and I won't give away too much to identify him, but we went to the party and it was at his house and we're out the back and I'm looking going, that's a dope plant. Sure enough, there's 5 plants growing in his backyard. And he was, you know, it wasn't his, of course, it was his son's. But it shows you that politicians have changed. They're just not as comfortable about saying that publicly. So again, this was some of the pictures from overseas that they saw, and they saw how it should look. So the first thing I did on the day the first day of Parliament, I read in a bill called the Cannabis Regulation Bill. And I have put the Victorian Parliament on notice that I intend to try and legalise cannabis in Victoria by 2022. I know. There's the date. Now, how are we going to do that? So I did look at Canada and I did use it as a model because I thought it was a very good place to start, and it was a fairly reasonable piece of legislation, in my opinion, when you were looking at a safe place for politicians to go. And again, bearing in mind that first reason, which was to keep cannabis out of the hands of criminals and children. So mine will do this, it will do that, it will do that, it will do that, it will do that, it will do that. The bill is still being developed, so there's nothing for me to show you now. Certainly, if you want to get up on my website, I've got a bit more detail about what the structure of that bill and that legislation, what it's starting to look like. But I still haven't convinced 51% of my political colleagues to support this just yet. But, as I say, I've got till 2022 to do that. So this is what we're doing. The other area that I will quickly touch on is road rules. And I know all of us, you know, have probably amended our transport options for coming to this place. We've seen the buses on the side. We've seen this absolutely ridiculous system of basically trying to bust us for merely using cannabis. Not for driving in an impaired way. And I think one of the most disappointing things about this police activity is the effect it has on people accessing medicinal cannabis. So here are people who are coming off incredibly strong opioids or coming off benzodiazepines and choosing cannabis as an alternative to that, so that they can sort of defog their brains and sleep better and feel better and eat better, but they can't drive. So for many patients who could qualify for medicinal cannabis, they won't take it because they can't take their kids to school in the morning, or they're fearful that even though they're not impaired, they won't be able to take their kids. So I've put up some amendments on this, that medicinal cannabis should be treated as any other prescription medication. It's very straightforward. If you've got a prescription for cannabis, just the same as if you've got a prescription for Ritalin, or you've got a prescription for another drug that has the possibility of being picked up on a saliva test, then you should be exempt from that. And we do that. We exempt prescription medications from driving under the influence or with a substance. That's not to say that we want impaired driving. But so I've put these up, but I've still got a little way to go to convince people that the mere presence of cannabis does not mean impairment. And I know that everyone in this room understands that, but we still have a little way to go to keep improving the rest of the world's and the rest of our community's understanding on that. So to that point, that's my where now. When I put up the notion that we would legalise cannabis, I got the Parliamentary Budget Office to do a costing on what that would look like. So what would that look like if we licensed cannabis dispensaries? What would that look like if we licensed cultivators? What would that look like for the courts? And the very conservative estimate was $204 million. Now, that is an incredibly conservative estimate. So while I'm trying to convince politicians to legalise cannabis, I've asked to have an inquiry into what would legalise cannabis look like. Let's ask the question. We know that 46% of the population want cannabis legalised. So I think that gives us a mandate to actually ask that question. Now, I've said to the government, you don't have to support me, you don't have to agree with legalising cannabis. All I'm asking you to do is agree to ask the question. And these are the terms of reference for it. Again, they're up on my website, but it is looking at what would this look like? How would we regulate it? How are they doing it in other jurisdictions? What would the economic impact be? A range of things I think are quite good questions to ask. Now, this will be debated on the 27th of May. So, and I have asked for us to report back in 2020. That's still giving me another 2 years from that point to try and move us on cannabis legalisation. We're seeing the ACT has already put a bill up to legalise the possession and use of cannabis rather than just decriminalise it, that it will actually no longer be any form of an offence. That certainly moves us forward in a very good way, and I'm very supportive of that. This would take us to another level, and it will ask a lot of questions. And also, how do we carve out a state of a federation to change our drug laws rather than trying to do it federally? And federally, obviously, would be ideal, but as we've seen in the US, that has been just about impossible. Well, not just about, it has been impossible. There is some legislation in the US coming forward, but we've seen the states act and be more nimble in responding to this. So I'm very hopeful that at the end of this month, this will happen. I have put up a fairly ambit claim, but I'm getting some support. I've got crossbench support, and I just need the government to allow me and allow the community to ask this question. The community might come back and say, no way, or we want it to look like this. I somehow doubt it. So that's all I really wanted to say formally, and I'd much prefer to open it up now, because this is the important part. What do we do next? And how do we change? To me, some of the real stumbling blocks for us is the stigma and discrimination that people who use cannabis experience. the stigma and discrimination that medicinal cannabis patients experience. I've been quite open about my drug use, and I got re-elected, so it's okay. You know, it's fine. I think, and I know it is hard, and particularly for people who are concerned about their employment, who are concerned about their family's judgment, but in some ways, like we saw with the marriage equality, like we saw with the LGBTI community, some ways coming out of the closet, and some of us really coming out there and being open and being brave, I believe is something that we are going to have to do here. And to me, it does seem like some of those same arguments, and I know Nick Wallace and I have talked about this for a number of years, so I was wondering whether we could send a photo to a politician of you smoking, maybe in inappropriate places, you know, maybe not nude. You know, I don't know whether they want to get dick pics, but, I mean, I don't mind. But I think that the conversation is, how do we move politicians? How do we give them the confidence? Because David Shoebridge, who's a MLC from the Greens, who I like very much, and he and I are aligned on many of these aspects. And we both have recently been re-elected. And standing out there on the polling booths, and we had call flutes saying legalise cannabis, and we just had people making a beeline for us for this. And David Shoebridge had the same experience in the New South Wales election. So people are out there, but we've got to show the politicians that it's worth a vote and that they can't, and they shouldn't be too scared. And for me, I'm not planning to spend, I think two terms in Parliament is quite enough. I think if you can't get things done in 2 terms, then really it's time to let somebody else have a go. I think the Reason Party has managed to get a lot done in 1 term, so it will be time for me to pass on to somebody else. But I really want to get this done before I leave. And I think there's an opportunity to do it, and I think there's an opportunity to really move this forward. Just listening to Martin's conversation, Martin's talk just a minute ago, you realise just how fast our knowledge on cannabis is going, and just how fast things are changing with that knowledge. And I think, you know, a year now is a short time in cannabis. You know, what we were talking about 12 months ago at MardiGrass is actually different to what we're talking about at MardiGrass this year. You know, we're starting to see the escalation of medicinal cannabis patients actually being approved. We're starting to see the first approved medicinal cannabis products being made in Australia. Now, that might not make everyone happy, but it shows this very fast progression, and I feel like it's about to scoot up. And I feel optimistic about it, and I think things like High as Mike really show that the conversation has changed. I encourage you all to see that film, by the way. But you know, I'd love to hear from other people about what other ideas or what other ways we can do, what else we can do to change the debate and to make our politicians comfortable with talking about pot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. And I have a microphone here for some questions, just this way.
Yeah, look, I went to court with a sniffer dog 23 times over 4 years, and I argued the point about drugs. They reckon I had drugs on me, and I argued the point and said, I have a herb on me. It's not a drug, it's a herb. I don't like the name drug for cannabis. It's a herb. And that I won the case.
Look, and I think that's a really good point, and that's a really good idea. You know, in some ways, you know, I guess I would have a policy of legalising all drugs, and I'm sorry to use that term because I think you're right. But if we start looking at cannabis as a herb, you know, I'm staying at this most gorgeous place just outside Nimbin that's got lemon myrtle and aniseed myrtle, and the health attributes that those plants have. And imagine banning a plant. We do. You know, there's a whole bunch of acacia growing at New South Wales Parliament that's technically illegal. But yeah, I think this is a good idea. Let's differentiate. Let's keep calling it a plant. Let's keep calling it a herb. And I will try and change that in my mind. So I thank you for that.
Hey Fiona, thanks for all that you do. I was just wondering on your vision for in the idea of the model based on Canada's keeping cannabis away from criminals and children. Where do you see the place for cannabis activists that have been charged, like the likes of Jenny Haslam in Victoria, and a position that they have in an upcoming legalised market?
Yeah. I think this has to. It's very important, and I know a lot of the jurisdictions in the US looked very carefully at this. I think Canada did as well. That you wouldn't necessarily absolutely prevent people who had been active in the cannabis community from being active in the legal cannabis industry. I know that was a question that was being asked. No, having an offence under our current laws should not preclude you from entering into the market as it does currently. I've also, just as an aside, I've just put up some legislation called spent conviction legislation, which is about if someone is found, has been prosecuted or convicted of a crime, after 7 to 10 years, that crime can be removed from their public police record, which would change some of those historical prosecutions. But yes, that's got to be a consideration in going forward. Did that answer that? Yeah. Yeah. I just think we have to make sure that can't be an exclusion from working in a legal industry in the future.
What special things did Canberra do to get their things through into Parliament so quickly?
They're just more sensible than us, which is weird saying that about Canberra. But the ACT local government is a very unique beast, and it's a small parliament. I think it's got 26 or 28 members now. It's like a big local government, and the Labor government of the day has allowed one of their members to introduce a private members bill, and that's unusual. But in a small parliament like that, that's possible. So. And ACT decriminalised the use and possession and cultivation of cannabis back in the early 90s. And when they first did it, it was 5 plants, and I think it was a $50 fine. That has been tinkered with. In fact, let's out him. Bill Stefaniak, who was the Attorney General, who was found with the dope plants that in his garden, he tinkered with it and he changed the rules and criminalised it further, which, hypocrisy, not much. But yes, so they've gone that way. It's now gone to a committee, and I think that was very political that the Greens and the Liberals banded together to not pass the legislation as it stood. So it's now sitting in a committee. It will be interesting to see what happens after the federal election. And if that ACT law passes, because the federal government still has the right to overturn that law. Now, the last time they did that was when they overturned the assisted dying laws in the Northern Territory. Oh, yes, pretty much. And I don't think that they would do that again. I think you look at where we went with assisted dying in Victoria, and the community opinion is so... has changed so enormously, and I wonder whether they would be brave enough to do it for cannabis this time.
Thanks, Fiona. Back on the criminal issue and the black market issue as well, because one of the big problems that some jurisdictions have found in legalising is that they essentially have to compete with the black market.
Yeah.
They can go out and still try and prosecute, but then it also becomes a bit frustrating for those that are operating in the black market. So, we touched on that a little bit before, but
Yes.
is there the potential for something like an amnesty for people that are currently operating, but these people might be, narco criminals? But
Yes.
Can we run like a small business scheme for these people running grow farms and say, all right, well, you can't do it that way anymore, but get your business certificate and you know.
I think that's entirely sensible, Nick, and I go back to my, sex, drugs and the electoral roll. There's a book in that. Actually, there is a book. But in my time in lobbying for the sex industry, that's exactly what we did. So the most successful models for legalising the sex industry that was and it was always perceived that the industry was run by criminals, the easiest way to do that was actually to bring everybody in the tent and to bring them with you. And I would see that would be exactly what we would try and do in working towards a legalised model, particularly when we might be only looking at one state, bringing everyone with us. And Colorado, when you compared Colorado to California, Colorado, the police estimate that they have captured about 85% of the market fits within the legal market, that there's about 15% that's not. And that's by ensuring that tax model, or the sale price, the retail price of that product does not put it above, does not make it more worthwhile to try doing it in the illegal market. So there's that sweet spot you've got to find. But I think 85% is pretty good. Like I think tobacco sales in Australia, we've probably got around 20% illegal tobacco sales now. In that regulated market. So I think that's pretty good. California, on the other hand, because it is the Mole Bowl of America, and I think they're also exporting to Mexico now, they are going to find it very difficult because they have such a large export industry there. And they're going to find it very difficult to bring that export industry into a regulated market where they will be prohibited from exporting. So California is going to be... its localised market is already starting to work, but I have no doubt there is still a large illicit market in California because Missouri needs to get their cannabis somehow.
Yeah, definitely Colorado has good prices for pot. The last time I was there, they had $100 ounces on sale the day I went into one of the dispensaries, and they were so nice. They gave me, because I was, a tourist, they gave me different types of pot in little eighths. Yeah. So I had like a sample bag for my couple of weeks there. It was awesome.
I know.
Yeah.
I had such great service over there, and also in Vancouver. Unfortunately, just after I'd had such great service, I got a phone call from a shock jock saying, "You ready to talk?" I'm like, "Sure, I'm ready to talk."
Let it flow.
But he did ask me whether I was stoned, and I just said yes.
I was thinking the other thing, talking about going on your tour with the politicians, like, surely that experience shows you the level of sophistication of the industry in the regulated markets, like in Colorado, how it's so inoffensive. Because you sort of think, what are people worried about? Yeah. And that's probably even a question that might be worth asking your colleagues that aren't convinced. Make them think, what is it that they're worried about? Yeah.
And what they're worried about is declining. Like, it's getting more and more difficult for them their arguments against regulation, legislation, decriminalisation, or any of those are getting less and less and less. Schizophrenia. Schizophrenia. They are running out of reasons. One would be, alcohol's so bad, so why do we want another drug on the market? And that one's fairly easily worked through. And then some of the stats that are coming out of Colorado, where they are seeing reduced levels of violence, particularly alcohol-related violence, where we're seeing reduced levels of opioid overdoses in jurisdictions. So the arguments for legalisation are becoming more and more and more compelling, and the arguments against it less and less so. Gateway drug, children, all of those things, can all be answered with regulation.
Yeah, very good. Fiona, thank you so much. That was very, very exciting and interesting. And
Thank you.
Hopefully...
Now, don't forget to send your pot pics to a politician.
Absolutely, you can do it. I'll be